we'll start. Ooh, careful. One question I want to ask before we start is, how many of you have ever made gluten from scratch yourselves? Anybody? Nobody? Oh, Verna has. Have you done it with dough pep, or have you done it the old-fashioned way?
Well, I don't do it the old-fashioned way anymore.
My Montana mom used to do it the old-fashioned way, and for those of you who don't know what the old-fashioned way is, they would actually take whole flour, make it in a dough, soak it in water, and then wash the starch out so that all that was left was the gluten. And we had a cooking school in Montana. My Montana mom demonstrated how to do that kind. And so I was at a health food store and I saw gluten flour. And I thought, oh, that must have really high concentration of gluten in it for them to call it gluten flour. So I got some and I put it in my mixer and I put in the water and I was going to make my dough, and I had instant rubber bands. Because what gluten is it's the elastic stuff that holds bread together. Okay? And I don't know how they get that elastic stuff away from the starch and put it in a little bag so that you can buy gluten, but that's what they do. And so what we're going to do today is we are going to do a gluten recipe using gluten flour, which makes it much simpler. And the first thing that we're going to do is we are going to make a broth. And that's the easy part. Actually, it's all easy. None of it's hard. So you put about a tablespoon. I'm a dump cook. I don't always measure everything exactly. You have to excuse me for that. A tablespoon, two tablespoons?
That was
2 tables. No, I'm trying to remember what the recipe says. 1 tablespoon is what the recipe calls for.
This is onion?
This is onion.
Onion.
It is 2 chopped onions in my cute little onion container. A plug for Tupperware. I got that at the price at a Tupperware party. And it calls for 1 large stalk of celery. This is 2 small stalks of celery because my celery wasn't very big. And you just saute them. The purpose of sauteing them is that it takes, I gotta figure out my heat on this stove. It takes and breaks down the onion and the celery, which are very firm vegetables, and it breaks them down softer. It also, what I like about it is that if you're careful with it, you can get the onions to brown a little bit, and you get that nice caramely onion flavor in the broth, which is really nice. So my broth usually has a little bit of that to it. It doesn't take it long. You're going to just cook them until they're translucent. And I'm assuming most of you cook, so most of you know what I mean when I say that, because an onion, when you first put it in, is very opaque. You can't see through it. But as you cook it, it turns yellowish, and it gets so that you can kind of, reminds you kind of a frosted window. So we're going to let that cook for a little bit.
Lorraine,
Yes,
did you use oil with that, or you?
I did. I put about a tablespoon of olive oil
Have you ever sauteed the
with just water.
with just water?
I don't usually, because I like that little bit of oil in the broth when I go to thicken it. You could saute it with water if you don't want any oils in your 1 tablespoon of oil in a whole batch of gluten. Isn't a whole lot of oil by my standards. So, but if you're trying to cut all the oils out of your diet, you really don't want to cut all the oils out of your diet. Your body needs a certain amount of oil.
Can get it from avocados.
Avocados are good, and you could use avocado oil. I do use avocado oil a lot more than I used to. I like peanut oil, not for this, but for when I want to fry things, because peanut oil doesn't absorb as much. But I don't usually use peanut oil if I'm doing something for a group of people, because lots of people have peanut allergies and I don't want to set, peanut allergies are really bad and I don't want to set anybody off. So I stick to olive or avocado. Trying to think, there was something I cooked today that I used avocado oil in. I don't remember what it was now. I did a lot of cooking today. Okay, so once these are sauteed so that they're translucent, thank you. I need prompts.
I'm paying attention.
Good. You're going to add 12 cups of water. You're going to do this, you're going to do it in a big pan. This pan is just barely big enough for what I'm doing. You're going to add 5 tablespoons of McKay's chicken style seasoning or something similar to that. And you do have some recipes for some substitutes for that if you can't find it. You're going to put in 1 tablespoon of garlic powder. And this is a half a cup of soy sauce. I use soy sauce in my broth. Some people don't like to use soy sauce and they use Bragg's liquid Aminos instead, which is also soy. If you don't want soy at all, if you're one of those people who soy doesn't agree with you, Bragg's also has coconut aminos. My daughter has started using this because she discovered soy wasn't good for her and was causing some of her problems that she had health-wise. So,
and the liquid aminos, why do people use that rather than regular soy sauce?
regular soy sauce, I believe, is fermented, and some people don't like to use fermented things, and the Bragg's isn't. I never have decided which one's saltier. To me, I think soy sauce is a little bit saltier.
I heard there's a lot more sodium than soy sauce.
Yeah, you can get a low sodium soy sauce now. I haven't tried it yet. I'm still working on that bottle. You're gonna put the lid on, you're gonna put it on high because you want it to come to a boil for the next part.
Lorraine,
Yes.
the aminos, maybe I missed that. Why do you need that?
It gives it the saltiness. It also gives it kind of a better flavor. I don't know, it's mainly for the salt content. Because there isn't much salt in this.
Okay.
I used to like it because it gave it more of a beefy flavor, but I put the chicken style in it because when my kids were little, we would, instead of fried chicken, potato salad and corn on the cob, we would have fried gluten potato salad and corn on the cob. Because I would fry it up just like I would fry up chicken. And that's how the gluten steaks that you had today were done, the same way I used to do when I do chicken. So, Tammy, you far enough away from me? I will try not to fluff it too much. This is 3 cups of gluten flour. To that, you add a 1/4 cup of whole wheat flour, a 1/2 cup of white flour, and the reason you're adding this to it is you don't want rubber bands. The gluten flour is very stretchy and very
Spongy?
no, not spongy, tight, like a rubber band. That's why I call it rubber bands. The regular flour loosens it up a little, so it's not quite so chewy. If you make it and you say, oh, that's too soft, I'd like it to have a little bit more chew, then just put a little bit more gluten flour in it the next time you make it. It also has 2 tablespoons of yeast flakes, 1 tablespoon of garlic powder, and 1 tablespoon of onion powder, not onion salt, onion powder. And you mix those together. You want them mixed together so that when you add the liquid, you don't get a clump of gluten, and I'll show you what I mean. Gluten's interesting because the first time I made it, I thought, looks like meat. If you were ever a meat eater, you know what marbling is in meat. It's where the fat runs through the meat. When you look at gluten when you make it, it will have a look similar to that, because where there's thick bands of where there's more gluten and less of the other, it will make it look marbled, kind of like meat looks. I think I've got that mixed up enough. Then you're going to take 3 cups of cold water, and this is Bragg's. I usually use Bragg's in this, and I use soy in that, just for the difference in the flavors. This is a little bit milder flavor, and I'm going for chicken style steak, so I want to put my Aminos in here, and then you just pour it in. You can do this in a mixer. It will work in I use my KitchenAid usually, but I didn't want the noise of it, so I'm going to do it the way I used to do it before I started doing it in the mixer.
It's hot water?
It's cold water.
Cold water.
It's cold water. You don't want hot. You want it cold because you want it to mix.
Yeah.
If you don't like getting your fingers dirty, then you're going to want to do it in your mixer. I don't mind getting my fingers dirty, so once I have the water starting to soak in, I just get my hands in there and I just work it until I get all the dry ingredients wet. And the more you mix it, the more you work your hands with it, the more rubbery it gets. I guess is the right word. As it comes together, as it all gets wet, once you've got all the dry part is now wet, there shouldn't be any in the air anymore, you end up with something that looks like this. And you can see it pulls apart, and you want to knead it a little bit. And it doesn't knead like bread kneads. You can do it this way, but the thing is it doesn't always want to join together. So the way I knead it is I just take it and I usually break it into 2 pieces, like that. And I just work it for a while. And the more you work it, the more, can you see the difference between those 2 pieces, the way they look? The more you work it, the more elastic it becomes, and the more like bread dough. This is still will pull apart. This will not pull apart as much. You want to make 2 rolls. That's why I break it in half. Plus it's easier on my hands to do it small than to try and do it large. Do the other one. Now this is going to make some fairly soft. I can tell just from the way it's working.
So what is gluten?
Gluten is the elastic part of wheat flour. The other is starch. And so if you were working from regular flour, if you were doing this the old-fashioned way, you would actually make a ball of dough. You would soak it in water, then you'd hold it under the faucet and wash all the starch out until all you had left was something that looks like this. So if you buy gluten flour, you can save all that time and just do it this way. So I have 2 rolls now. Kind of rolls. That one's kind of short and skinny.
Gluten is the protein in the meat.
It's the protein. Oh, thank you. The reason for using gluten is because it is a very concentrated protein. So you don't want to use it every day. You don't want to eat it in great, huge quantities because it's tough on your kidneys. But it is a protein source. So it's a way to make something that you can put into other recipes or eat it as steaks once in a while. But like I used it in the gluten cacciatore instead of chicken. Like I said, I have a meatball, really good meatball recipe that uses it. But anything that would call for one of those canned meat products, recipes that call for things like that, you could use this instead. So when you've got, am I boiling? Almost.
Grind it up and use it
As hamburger, like you would hamburger.
Hamburger.
Mm-hmm. You could put it into chili, you could put it into soups, you could put it in lots of things. I even have some recipes, and if anybody's interested, I'll dig them out. I have recipes for making sausage. It's just the seasonings that you put in with it that make it sausage flavored. But there are lots of things that you can make with it. And since I had had several people who had asked me how to make gluten, I thought I would start with that with this class.
You can cut it into small pieces and put it into stir fry. I do that frequently.
Can you freeze that?
You can. What's really nice about it is when you get done, you'll have broth. Sometimes if you like the flavor of the broth, you can thicken it and use it for gravy. But freeze it in the broth. I find it seems like it does better if you freeze it in the broth than without. Just enough to make it moist. It doesn't have to be a whole lot of the broth, because usually I cook mine down, there's not a lot of broth left.
I discovered a new way to do it, quite by accident.
What was that?
Unintentional.
Come stand up here so everybody can hear you, Harold. I'm waiting for this to boil, so.
I was making rolls. Unfortunately, I got the wrong container, and I made my rolls with gluten flour.
Oh dear.
And when I discovered that, I went ahead and cut. It was hard to handle because it was, you couldn't really roll it out or anything. That's when I discovered it was gluten flour. But when I discovered that, then I cut it into small pieces, and most of it, well, I baked them. Then I put them in the freezer. And when I was making a stir fry or something and wanted gluten, I go to the freezer and pull out 2 or 3 of these things and soak them in water for a few minutes, put it in the microwave, then chop it up, put it in my stir fry, instant gluten. And I think I spread out the use probably at least 3 or 4 months, maybe as much as 6 months. That, you know, when I wanted some gluten, I'd go to the freezer and pull out one of these biscuits. And no, I've never seen any recipe for it. I doubt that anyone would recommend it. But I can tell you, it worked really well. Even though it had everything that you normally put in rolls, you know, like the yeast and whatever else, but it worked fine.
Well, this recipe that I've given you for the gluten steaks is actually was made by a friend of mine in Montana, and her original recipe had yeast in it, and you would take it and you would wrap it in foil and it would fall up, and then you would cook it, slice and cook it, and it made these big fluffy things that were kind of like dumplings. And that wasn't what I wanted my gluten to be like. I wanted my gluten to be a little chewier. So I left out the yeast and kept the rest of the recipe, and that's what you're getting. Because my reason for using it was I had been a meat eater, and every now and then you just want something that you have to chew on.
Put this over there.
That's not a carrot stick or a piece of celery. And so my reason for starting to use gluten was to use it every now and then when I wanted something that was kind of like eating fried chicken, but it wasn't eating fried chicken, or that I could use in place of that for that type of a flavor. and a consistency. And like I said, it's not something that we eat a lot, but we do eat it occasionally because I do like it, and so does Marshall. And my granddaughter was really sad when she found out Grandma was making gluten like mad the last few days. You know the old saying about a watched pot? So the reason I have a lot of gluten right now was I made a batch, which is back up there on the table, all done up. I made a batch to show you what it looks like as the finished product, and I'm going to show it to you now, even though we're not there yet because my water's not quite ready. My broth's not quite ready.
Can I ask you a question
Yes.
again? What you said earlier, you don't want to eat a lot of gluten because it can be hard on the kidneys?
It's such a concentrated protein is why. And your kidneys have to filter that protein out, some of that byproducts of that protein out. And so it can be really hard on your kidneys if you eat too much of it. That's why even the canned, there's lots of canned meat replacement type things that have been around for a long time. Eating those as a steady diet is not a good thing. For the same reason, they have gluten in them and probably not in the same concentrations as this is. But
So
close.
what would be a good, I guess, an acceptable amount to eat? It'd be how often probably you eat and how much, but
Harold,
or
how
what's too
often
much?
do you use gluten products?
How often do I use them?
In a week? Do you use them even once a week?
Well, if I put it in stir fry, the stir fry usually lasts at least 3 or 4 days because I don't know.
But
how
in a
to make-
stir fry, you're not eating half of this thing, you're just
No.
eating a little bit. So you're eating, yeah, so I would say, once or twice a week, you're probably not gonna hurt yourself by eating it. It's just you don't want
Your
to,
pot's boiling.
you don't want to sit down and eat half of my casserole dish full of gluten over there.
Your pot is boiling.
If possible.
Oh, good. Thank you. Because I want to show you something that Pastor learned with the first time he made gluten. It doesn't look like much, does it? It grows. Now, this is a trick of mine. If my blade's wet, it cuts through this sticky stuff easier. So you cut it into pieces. I never go thicker than that. Sometimes I go thinner than that, but I never go thicker than that because it's not going to stay this size. I want you to think about what size I'm putting in there because you're going to be amazed at what gluten does. Oh, I was going to show you. Get a piece here. Monica, would you take this piece around and let them see? I want them to be able to see that it has that kind of marbling in it.
Let me wash my hands for
Oh, okay. Well, I won't put this one in the thing.
Okay.
It'll go in the garbage when you're done.
We'll feed that to Harold.
Whoa.
That was cold.
He'll eat anything.
Well, I wondered if we were going
Thank
to
you.
look at
Thank you.
to see how it's doing with the gluten.
Yeah, how does it feel?
Actually, these that I'm cutting right here have it even better than that piece does. You could probably even see it from here. But it has darker spots in it, which are like marbling. Those spots that are darker
Never noticed that.
will actually be more chewy than the lighter spots. Because those darker spots are where, when the water went into the gluten, it grabs the gluten really fast. And it doesn't grab the flour as fast. So that's how you get that little bit of difference.
Yeah, that's not good.
I thought that's where the blood vessels ran.
Yeah, okay. The veins from the plant. So anyhow, so I'm taking this and I'm dropping it into my boiling stuff here. And it will start growing. Everything is on high.
You could have dropped it in the boiling stuff there, it would have killed whatever's on there.
So So my broth is going, my gluten's going in the broth.
Might have beat me with the burn.
Now the broth, you're gonna put it in the broth and you're gonna get to see how it puffs up. When it puffs up, I usually stir it down a couple times and then I turn it down on low and I let it just simmer. And depending on how long you want to let it simmer, I think the flavor gets even better the longer it simmers. Pastor was telling me when we were talking about it that it also gets chewier the longer you cook it. And I don't know that I've ever really noticed that, but it could be true.
Well, can you overcook it?
No. Not unless you burn it to the burn all the broth out, cook all the broth out and burn it to the bottom of the pan. I've done some batches where I've let it simmer all afternoon. The stuff that you ate today, I think I cooked about 2 hours.
So if we wait 2 hours, we'll be able to see you finish that?
No, I'm going to show you some that's done. And I'm going to take this, I think, back and put it on that other burner because this little hot plate just doesn't quite cook it as well. But you see how much bigger that piece is than this is? Can you see it already starting to grow? It's already starting to get a little bit bigger. If that was boiling full power like it should be, and it isn't, it would be even bigger by now. But we'll set it back there for a couple minutes and that burner back there will bring it back up to a full boil really fast. And then I'll be able to show you what I mean. Because when you're putting it in like this, of course your gluten, you just made that with cold water. So this is cold. So every time, the more I add, the more it cools down the broth. So you're always going to have your burner on high when you're first putting it in, so that it keeps boiling as you're putting it in. Some tricks that I've learned is you always want to make sure you drop it in a spot where it falls into the broth, because once it gets coated in the broth, it doesn't stick to the other pieces. If you drop it on top of another piece that you just dropped in there, they might stick together. Doesn't happen too often, but it does happen if you're not thinking about where you're dropping it in the pot. Usually when it's boiling, there's a spot kind of in the middle where you can just keep dropping pieces down and they go right into the broth. Okay, a couple more and we'll have them all in there. This is my 4th batch of gluten that I have made this week, in a week. Because I made some for potluck on Sabbath. Then I had to make a batch to cook for you guys for tonight. I'm making one now, and I made one so you could see what it looks like when it's done.
Thank you very much for doing all this work for us.
Well, my
Yes.
granddaughter was being sad that she wasn't at grandma's because she likes gluten. And her mama doesn't do it very often. Okay, so I'm going to set that back there for just a second. And put its little lid back on.
I have a question,
Yes,
because this is a large quantity.
it does.
And so, so what do you do? I mean,
You freeze it.
you freeze it after it's already cooked?
Yep.
You can freeze it.
Yeah, you freeze it after it's already cooked. This has been already cooked. This started out same size as what you saw. You can see how much
Oh, wow.
bigger they are. And there's a little bit of onion on them and there's a little bit of celery on them because they're still sitting in the broth. But this is what you end up with. Now, you can bread them and fry them, like I did for the steaks. You can take and cut it up into small strips to put in your stir fry, like Harold likes to do. He likes to put the little pieces in his stir fry. If you were going to do, and I will find that recipe as soon as I figure out where my box has disappeared to, you take it and you chop it up fine and you green onions. Unfortunately for my gluten-free person, it's got breadcrumbs in it, but maybe you could use cornbread crumbs in it instead of regular breadcrumbs.
Well, you're putting gluten in it, so.
Oh, that's true, you can't eat it anyway. Never mind.
Nice try.
Forgot what I was thinking.
The gluten is the poison.
Yeah.
So gluten is really healthy,
Yeah,
correct?
it's a good protein source,
And not
Yeah, but
everyone
it's
can
just-
eat it.
but not everybody can eat it because
Yeah.
there are people who are gluten-free, that have gluten allergies and can't eat gluten, so it doesn't help them. And we will, in one of the other classes that we'll do in the spring, or later this winter, we will talk about other protein
I'm
sources.
glad that I'm not.
Because that is something that people tend to worry about for not any good reason. Okay, we're almost there. Now,
I used to chunk my gluten steaks and put them in a pot pie.
put them in a what?
Pot pie.
Oh, a pot pie, that's a good idea. I like that. My husband likes pot pies. Remember that one.
I have a question.
Okay, yes.
So once you get them like your steaks back there where you breaded them, fried them, then what do you do with them? You just reheat them like in the microwave or something, or?
Yeah, you can. They'll reheat in the microwave.
Sometimes they put sauce over them and then bake them. And that way it's like a casserole dish.
Yeah, you could put them in a noodle casserole, chunk them up and put them in a noodle casserole. You could put barbecue sauce on them and bake them in the oven and.
But once they're done that way and you put them away after, you're done eating, you put away the leftovers, you can just kind of.
Yeah, you can just warm them up. They make nice sandwich, they're nice in a sandwich.
When we were still using dairy, we'd often take a can of mushroom soup and put over them.
And warm them up that way.
Warm them up that way. That's always delicious.
Yeah. Yeah, because you can make a stroganoff with them. You can, anything that you would normally put meat into, you can use it in place of. There aren't too many things that you can't. Now, can you see that it's starting to reach the top of my pan? It's not quite there, but it's almost there. Because they are puffing up big and fat and lovely. And you saw how little they were when I cut them and put them in here. So they go at least double in size. And I'm not going to bother to bread and fry them because I figure most of you can probably figure out how to do that. Like I said, if I'm frying them for just us at home, I will usually use a little peanut oil in the pan. Just because it doesn't absorb as much as olive oil does. You can also bread them and bake them in the oven. That's not my favorite way of doing them. Unfortunately, Harold, I like fats. Obviously. But that's how you make gluten. Any other questions? Yes, Pat?
Did you want me to tell my story?
Yes, please.
So when I was in college at Walla Walla, I was the breakfast cook at the cafeteria, so I learned to cook in large quantities. So I made my first batch of gluten about 20 years ago, and I decided that after I mixed up the one and I did it in the mixer, I thought that's just such a little amount. I quadrupled the recipe, and I had a pot much bigger than that. It was a 12-quart pot that I was cooking, and I had the broth in there, and so I started dropping in there, and then it started growing and growing and growing, and so I realized that I needed to go get a larger pot than that and make another batch of broth and continue cooking them in the other pot. And so I had all of this gluten, but we took it and froze it, and we used it for several months.
But you was not expecting that it will be
I didn't know it
multiplied.
was going to multiply like that.
Yes.
Was this an I Love Lucy moment?
Very much so.
She Sharon came home from work and she said, my goodness, what's going on here? But we enjoyed those. So I just put them in a strainer and drain them, and then put them in baggies and freeze them. That way they're easier to break apart than if they have liquid with them, then it freezes solid. So,
Thank you for sharing.
So anyhow, this is a batch that's been done. This one was done yesterday. This is our batch that's cooking right now, and it will need to cook for a while. I'll take it home and finish cooking it.
How do you know that when it's done?
It doesn't take it long. You take a little piece. What do you say? That tastes good. I mean, it's already, I don't know if you can see the line down the center. It's almost done enough that you can take it off the stove. But the recipe says to cook in the sauce for 2 hours. That's about average for me.
It's for the flavoring that you leave it that long.
Yeah, it gets more flavor. Right now, it doesn't really, I mean, you've got the flavor of the ingredients that you put in the dough itself.
But it's still not bad.
2 hours from now, it will taste like this one does. You see, there's no dark line in the middle anymore. That tastes really good. This doesn't have the flavor